have not very often talked, do I need this? No, about my experiences. And I'm no public speaker by any means. But the Holocaust survivors are dwindling down. They're getting very old, or we're losing them. They would be at least 80 years old today in general, because the largest part of the Holocaust survivors were at the time between 20 and 50. So somebody has to step up and continue the tradition. And my daughter-in-law, who is very involved in Jewish life in this area, really bamboozled me into this. She asked me if I would please speak at Roger Williams University to the Hillel Society, which is the Jewish fraternity which goes through all colleges in the United States. And said a couple of kids will be in attendance. Would you talk about your experience? And because of my grandson, I felt I should do that. And when I got there, the auditorium, which holds 200 people, was filled, and the cafeteria, which holds 100 people, was filled, and it was being broadcast to the cafeteria. So I spoke for the first time to 300 people, and as I said, I was bamboozled. My Holocaust story is unique in as far as I survived, my brother survived, my parents survived, and one set of grandparents survived, which is very unusual. During the first year after the war in 1945, nobody in my life talked about the war, shared their experiences about the war, and even though today it says, never forget, that's the slogan, in the 1940s, people tried to forget. They wanted to come to terms with the horrors they had experienced, and they wanted to mourn their losses and get back into the mainstream of life. I was lucky. My parents never dwelt upon the years that we spent in the concentration camps, nor did they sweep it under the rugs. And they were able to raise their children as, quote, normal people without too many hang-ups. Though I must admit my one big hang-up is I cannot throw out food. And whenever my grandchildren come for a meal, the first thing they do, they inspect the expiration date on the mayo. When the survivors were ready to start talking about their experiences, for some it became a career. They went on the lecture circuit and they informed the world about the atrocities that were committed and how they lived through it. Those were mainly immigrants from Europe which settled in the United States, and they made the Holocaust their life. Others internalized everything. They never shared anything with anybody. Matter of fact, after they might have lost a spouse and remarried, they never even talked about it with their second families. Others wrote books, and believe it or not, 65 years after the end of the war, books are still written about the Holocaust by survivors, or by the children of survivors, or by the second generation. I received 2 monthly international publications which come from Jerusalem, in which, in the back of the, I have one of them here, in the back of the little newspaper, there are ads, personal ads, from people who are still today, 65 years after the fact, they are looking for closure by asking if anybody has seen during the war years their parents, their grandparents, their siblings, people who just disappeared, and they are trying to find out what happened. They are still today looking for closure. My parents were born respectively in 1906 and 1907. And they lived in Cologne, Germany. They married in 1932. And in 1936, when it became apparent that Hitler did not tolerate the Jews, they moved to Holland. I was 1 year old. I was born in 1935. My father was a metal trader and worked for an international company that also had offices in Amsterdam. So he was able to continue his professional life. It really was not a culture shock because Cologne is 2.5 hours by car from Amsterdam. So culturally, the move was not dramatic, but my parents had to learn a new language. And I was brought up bilingually in German and in Dutch. We went to Holland together with both my sets of grandparents. My family assumed that the political upheaval would not spread to Holland, and in their wildest imagination could they believe that Hitler would invade Holland in 1940, and after valiant fighting by the Dutch army and severe bombing of the coastal town of Rotterdam, the Dutch army capitulated and we were under German rule. The war years from 1940 to 1945 correspond to my age, 5 to 10 years old. My memories are similar to maybe a movie you may have seen many, many years ago. You remember certain scenes. Some other scenes are very misty and very vague. In Elie Wiesel's latest novel called Mad Desire to Dance, the main character is being questioned about the accuracy of his memory, and I was struck by a paragraph that states, quote, "With the years, the past becomes blurred. We forget real events and remember dreams or imaginary events." Another Holocaust survivor, Edith Milton, writes in her book Tiger in the Attic, quote, "Over the years, the landscape of memory shifts and the details rearrange themselves." I believe my memories are accurate, though quite possibly they may have been reinforced and influenced with conversations with other Holocaust survivors and by the very many books that I've read. During the first year of our occupation in Amsterdam, 1940, there were very slow changes. I was placed in the one and only Jewish school in Amsterdam, a Montessori school, and I was told that my favorite occupation was polishing copper. Little by little, new laws were introduced. Jews could only go to Jewish doctors and Jewish dentists. There were curfews. No buses, no trams were allowed. Jews were not allowed in theaters, movies, parks, playgrounds, museums, and we all had to wear a Jewish star sewn on our outer clothing, which said J-O-O-D, which means Jew in Dutch, Jood. Life was bearable from what I can remember as a 6-year-old. I thought I had a normal life. Edith Milton again writes about her childhood during World War II. "Children tend to accept as normal whatever world they happen to find themselves in." So I was not alone in my reaction. Every Jewish person received an ID card with a big J on it, and for every man, the name Israel was added, and for every woman, the name Sarah. So I became Ruth Sarah. Then things slowly but surely became harsher. Jews had to turn over the valuables, radios, bicycles, and they had to vacate their home. We had to leave our beautiful apartment and moved into a small apartment in East Amsterdam, which became a kind of ghetto. There were several apartment buildings, and those were taken over, and all Jews had to live there. There were no guards, there was no barbed wire, it was just a concentration of Jewish people. But as soon as a Jewish family had moved out of their home, the German trucks came and they took everything of value, furniture, paintings, china, whatever was not taken along, because we only could take very little, was taken and was transported to the Third Reich. Then the so-called razzias, or the translation is roundup, they started. German trucks with penetrating loud sirens randomly stopped in front of the buildings and very unceremoniously rounded up the Jews living in a particular floor, in particular apartments, and they were shoved into the open trucks that drove off. It was an unwritten rule that every member of the family had a rucksack, a backpack, with the basic necessities of life near the front door that could be grabbed as the SS soldiers were herding us out into the trucks. I remember standing with a group of people who lived in the apartment next to us, near the window, looking at one of those razzias, one of those roundups, behind a gauze curtain. I was holding a stuffed animal which was very pink, and somebody suddenly grabbed me and pulled me back and said, "No, you can't stay here because you may draw attention with that big pink animal." The unwritten rule during World War II, I think, was don't draw attention to yourself. Mix in with the masses. Disappear into the masses. My father always had hoped to escape these razzias because he worked for a metal firm. And even though that company was taken over by the Germans with German and non-Dutch management overseeing the day-to-day operations, they still needed the people who did the actual buying and selling and dealing with the metals, because metals was a very necessary commodity for the Germans. In 1943, our life changed. It became apparent that no Jew would stay in Amsterdam. So my father, my mother, my brother, and I went into hiding into an attic of non-Jewish friends, like Anne Frank. You must have all seen the movie. It was not like a whole big setup with kitchen and bathroom or what have you. All I remember is a big attic, 4 twin beds, table and chairs, and I guess we were up during the night and slept during the day. We lived like that for a short while, maybe 2 or 3 weeks. But my parents, especially my father, had no stamina to live that way. His philosophy was, if we get picked up, if we are being discovered, no questions asked, we send straight away to the east, which meant usually a death camp. So one day, we very carefully left there and moved back into our little ghetto apartment in Amsterdam.